Good afternoon. We are happy to have you all join us in the discussion today of the role of Boston's historic churches regarding slavery, truth-telling, and healing. It is especially fitting that we meet on the first National Day of Indigenous People, because Indigenous people were both enslaved and exported from this continent. And indeed, in 1638, when the first Africans arrived in the Boston area, they had been exchanged for Indigenous people who were taken to the Caribbean for enslavement. And so we honor the memory of Indigenous people, and we know that they have continued, as we have, to struggle for the freedom that is promised in the principles of the United States. We are very pleased today to have three panelists who are outstanding in their own fields and outstanding in every way in their thinking about today's topic. They are Lemerche Frazier, who is an artist as well as a poet and historian, and she is director of education at the Museum of African American History in Boston, as well as Nantucket. All of her work poses restorative justice entitled "Save Me from My Amnesia." We also have Byron Rushing, a longtime civil rights activist who served in the Massachusetts House of Representatives from 1983 to 2018, where his priorities were human and civil rights and the development of democracy, as well as local economic and housing development and healthcare. From 1972 to 1985, he was president of the Museum of Afro-American History in Boston, and he presently serves as vice president of the House of Deputies, the highest elected position held by a layperson in the Episcopal Church. And we have Reverend Nancy Taylor, who has served since 2005 as the senior minister and CEO of Old South Church in Boston. She is co-founder of Idaho's Wasamath Center for Human Rights and the Idaho Anne Frank Human Rights Memorial. I am Vivian Johnson, happy to be the moderator for today's discussion. We also have as a special guest today, Ann Cobb, who is the executive director of the Middle Passage Ceremonies and Port Markers Project. 6 weeks ago, on August 29th, a port marker was dedicated at Long Wharf in Boston in memory of captured Africans who perished and those who survived the Middle Passage and were enslaved. On the continental United States, there are 52 documented arrival port sites, and the Middle Passage Ceremonies and Port Markers Project has worked with residents of more than half of those sites to place port markers to commemorate the lives of these Africans and their descendants. At the recent port marker project dedication, the names of 50 enslaved and free African members of 5 colonial churches in Boston were read. The 5 historic churches are currently examining their membership archives and other documents to determine their relationship to slavery from its beginning in Massachusetts in 1638 to its legal in 1783. Those 5 churches are First Church of Boston, established in 1630, at the same time that the city of Boston was founded. King's Chapel, founded in 1686, and Old South Church, founded in 1669. Old North Church, founded in 1723, and Trinity Church, founded in 1733. So those 5 churches provided 10 names each of enslaved and free African members who were part of their congregations. A major role of the churches in colonial society was to Christianize enslaved Africans, to reinforce the social order. The purpose of today's discussion is to highlight some historical elements that provide a lens for examining possibilities for current discussion of societal healing. Some variation existed in the treatment of African members of historic colonial churches in Boston, but in no congregation were they usually full members because they could not vote, and they were always required to sit in the back of the sanctuary or possibly in a balcony. In rare cases, they were able to sit in other pews. Because the role of colonial churches was so dominant in 17th and 18th century Boston, we begin by questioning the frequent African presence in those churches. And we do that with the recognition that we are asking about people's decisions or their preferences in a system of enslavement. And slavery is in fact immoral and inhuman. And so there is great power on the one hand and great vulnerability on the other. But we ask those questions because we know that there was variation in the attitudes of Africans toward their attendance and their participation in those early churches. So one reason that they attended is that they were required to do so. In those years, nearly everyone went to church, and Africans lived in the homes of the people who enslaved them. They did not live in separate dwelling places. And the entire household went to church on Sundays. That's what people did. There was also the possibility that there was an opportunity to learn to read the Bible if one attended church. And that was certainly something that enslaved Africans would want to do. Another possibility is that people simply saw this as an opportunity to see their families and friends, and there weren't many such opportunities available to them. And then there is the possibility that Africans were in fact converted to Christianity, and that is why they were willing to attend those services. We simply don't know, but there are a number of possibilities that one might consider. There's also the possibility that this was an opportunity to see one's friends and relatives, because again, that was a rare opportunity given the workload that enslaved Africans endured in Boston and elsewhere. Lamurchi, would you give us an historic framework for thinking about the involvement of enslaved Africans in white Christian churches? Is there history to support our discussion?
Most certainly there is. I have found that that prior to coming to the shores of North America, before their arrival here, we have the evidence of Christianizing Africans on the continent itself that began in the 15th century. When we receive here, or the reception, which is no reception really at all, of Angela, Peter, and Pedro in 1619 at Fort Point Comfort. Those names are not accidental. They have come from Angola. They have come from an area where the Portuguese have started a colony. And in Luanda, they are really live in understanding what Christianity is and practicing in the 1500s. In fact, in 1491, Christianity is declared the state religion of the Congo. And it is one of the first to epistemize the Congo. So the Portuguese are quite influential in spreading Christianity and having the presence already there of what is going to be a plan, what becomes a plan to begin to enslave people. And by that, as they affect wars that even interrupt the life of the Congo and Ndango, as we know it on the west coast of Africa, there is this propensity to switch from an economy that is supported in Portugal and England and by the Dutch, from the economy that they've had to a slave economy. And in so doing, what becomes real in the New World is the enslaved people as currency, if you will. Rather than silver or the commodities, enslaved people become that currency that evokes power. So by the evidence of those who are Christianized, even before they come here, there's a question that I ask, and it has to do with the claim of civilizing the African and Christianizing the African when that has already begun to be initiated. And the fact that in places like the Castle of Hope and Accra, that these holes are mainly in a place that I had the opportunity to go in Zanzibar, where there was a church. The churches became these places of holes for the Africans who were going to be put onto ships and become these ports of no return. So when we think about how this 20 and odd Africans who were received in Jamestown in 1619 already have arrived as Christians, and the trauma that they've experienced in that 60 to 90 day journey tells us something about Christianity and its weight, Christianity and what is going to become somewhat the question of who's truly civilized, who's truly following the principles of Christ as it's laid down, and how that is used as an instrument to further and continue the institution of slavery. So the names that the names and the practices of the Iberian and Christian, what we call associated with Christianity and with Portugal, are not new. They are also wrapped into the political and economic survival, and become an instrument of war to create more captives. So as we look at the design of what's happening in and around what Christianity is used to do, not that Christianity in itself is evil or that it is bad. It is what it is used as an instrument to propagate. So the instance of racial slavery becomes based on doctrine that should be moral, that should be recognized in its portent to produce love and freedom. It becomes actually the antithesis of that for enslaved people. So to answer your question, to look at the occupation of space by Christianity and its doctrine, we have evidence that in places like Brazil, where the Portuguese are taking people to enslave them in large numbers, there is also what is called the survival of the syncretization of the African religions with Christianity. And so there's this very complex system of looking at the divine and threads of what is good and what is moral and what is sacred, that does not become completely erased in the African people. It becomes a process of memorization and retainment and reclamation in what has been called in Brazil quilombosis, or these places where people ran away from slavery and created spaces where they could practice the religions that are now called Candomblé, Mukumba, and Umbanda, that are using the Catholic saints to present principles that are in the African religions that have been that way. But in terms of where this takes place, it takes place throughout the Caribbean, in Puerto Rico, in Cuba, in Brazil. And so this idea that Christianity has traveled and is a familiar space, it is also a space that is customized, if you will, in some places by the Africans. It is a space of survival of one's collective identity. So it is a very complex question to answer as you've asked, Vivian. But in terms of how we look at places like Luanda, that was a colony, 1.3 million Africans came from that port of the 15 million that were taken from Africa. So there's a lot to reckon with in terms of where is Christianity in its weight there, where, what is happening there with the people who are socialized there.
Thank you. Could you tell us, Lamerchi, what happened then when Africans saw possibilities that were not the agenda of those who thought they were subjugating the Africans by the use of Christianity? And can you provide any examples of those possibilities operating in Boston?
Yes, I think I can do that. I will attempt to do that. I think as I've spoken to what has been syncretization of the Catholic saints. And for instance, when we look at the religion of Candomblé as it was practiced in Brazil and in places like Cuba, you look at the Virgin Mary being supplanted by Santa Barbara or either Yemaya, which becomes the patron saints of these particular places. And that's very obvious. That's a very obvious kind of syncretization. But in Boston, you don't have that kind of presence as a practice until later in the 20th century, when it is that African Americans are going to the Caribbean and seeking some knowledge of what has happened. I think the subversion of what becomes the practice of recognizing much that is in the scripture to describe one's situation after one is literate and understanding Bible scripture and being able to apply it as metaphor becomes somewhat a language that is inaccessible to those who don't understand the code of that language. And so that is one of the ways Christianity serves. But in places like when we think about Puritanism, and as it has been influential in the law of what becomes established in North America, we're looking at what becomes moral right and what is then the right that you have legally. And so people like Phyllis Wheatley and Prince Hall and the Committee of Abolitionists began to charge the Puritans with not having adherence to the moral code of their Puritanism or their Christianity. And they began to challenge this in ways that makes for the device of being property, being deemed property as something that is not moral under the eyes of God, and that the right to be free should be associated with just being human. And so when we look at what is being done in Boston, we can even go back to 1706 when you have the writing of Cotton Mather. And in his essay on the Negro Christianized, and we can just look at the way he introduces that. If I can just read what it says here on the frontispiece of the Negro Christianized in 1706, he says, an essay to excite and assist that good work, the instruction of Negro servants in Christianity. So when I was reading this document, it gave me a context of what people in the 18th century, and especially those who are Black, are in the context of what they are living in, is this idea that that poses many contradictions. That in this good work is the work of the Christian masters to Christianize their enslaved. He says here that the Christian has a moral responsibility for the souls of those in danger, and the Christianized servant is more profitable to his master. So there's this idea that in the sense of those who are making the decisions and in power as what they are calling quote unquote masters, there's this doctrine of white possessive logic that deems this property relationship from theft of people and property, from divesting people of their property who are indigenous, and those who are Black being deemed property. And the moral responsibility with that becomes that these are souls that you are responsible for, yet your consideration is how much profit you're going to get from this being so. And so in this document, there are many references to to freedom and liberty. And the question of that, if you are baptized, are you able to be free? And at the end of it, Cotton Mather raises that no, by the doctrine, certainly that is taken care of, because these are lowly creatures, and lowly creatures cannot attain the status of one who would be without his master's approval of being free. So I think in that context that those who were here were operating in a very complex and very interesting position. And by the Revolutionary War, I do believe that Christianity became an implement of those who were Black and their agency to then pose these questions to Puritanism, pose these questions to Christianity, and have their own steps toward embracing the abolition of slavery and causing Massachusetts to come to grips with that.
Thank you very much, Lamerchi. And I'm sure we will come back to some of the questions that you have raised with regard to Christianity. Byron, I would like to ask you a question about the work that is going forth in the Episcopal Church. And I understand that you have been involved with this work nationally. So would you tell us about the work of the Christian Church, of the Episcopal Church, in the area of truth-telling and in the area, excuse me, of healing? Byron, have we lost you?
No.
No, you, here I am. First, I would like to just say what a privilege is to be with you all this afternoon. I want to, though, just start with where Lamerchi left us off, because I think it's really essential that we understand that the experience of Africans in North America was really incredibly unusual in the whole context of slavery in the Americas. North America had the least slaves imported of any part of the Americas. Most, like 90% of Africans who came to the Americas came to the Caribbean and South America, Central and South America, and on the other, what needs to be understood is this North America was the center of white people. This is the place where you had the most European settler colonies in the Americas. And so I think you always have to keep that in the back of your mind, as we can't generalize from what happened to Africans in North America and the United States to what happened to Africans all over the Americas. For the Church of England and its introduction to the Americas, which of course was late, the English were some of the latest Europeans to come and colonize the Americas. That story, of course, begins with the whole story of colonization and slavery. The history of Black Episcopalians, like the history of Native Indigenous Episcopalians, begins with the Church of England and the invasion of North America and the Caribbean by the English. And for Black Episcopalians also, by the decision of the Church of England and after the American War of Independence by the Protestant Episcopal Church to vigorously support African and Black enslavement and the African slave trade by its members. I want to, before I move on, make sure that we understand and recognize that Black people in North America and other parts in the Caribbean and other parts of the Americas heard about a Christianity that in many ways interested them. And in the South, before the Civil War, they were able to find ways to practice a Christianity as they understood it. I have found just very helpful in trying to understand this, the work of Howard Thurman. In a small book that he wrote in 1945 called Deep River, whose subtitle was Reflections on the Religious Insight of Certain Negro Spirituals. Right? He writes these, he says that these words and verses from the spirituals by a people who were able to connect to the stories that they were hearing from the Bible, used and quoted by white enslavers, nevertheless saw in the source, in the stories themselves, not in any white exegesis, in the stories themselves, a God that they could believe in. And probably especially a Moses and a Jesus that made sense. And Thurman explains this way. By some amazing but vastly creative spiritual insight, the slave undertook the redemption of a religion that the master had profaned in his midst. And my words now, it is to this Christianity which many Africans in the Americas were converted. In the South, before the Civil War, they were able to find ways to practice this Christianity as individuals and groups apart from their enslavers. In the North, after the War of Independence, free Africans were able to begin to organize independent churches in public. And those congregations and very soon denominations were led by free African societies and individuals like Absalom Jones and Richard Allen in Philadelphia. In Boston, the first example of that movement is the community of African Americans who invite Thomas Paul, a Black minister from New Hampshire. Am I right, LaMarcia? New Hampshire, right? To found the African Baptist Church in 1805 and build the African Meeting House, which is still extant, in 1806. African Americans in the Episcopal Church conducted a major effort to have the white Episcopalians, who they were at least somewhat organizationally connected to have those white Episcopalians change their mind about the Christianity, to use Thurman's words, that those white Episcopalians had profaned. And so by the end of the Civil War, as more racial segregation in the Episcopal Church seemed to be expanding, the Black Episcopalians represented an organized effort to try to have that segregation not become more embedded in the structure of the Episcopal Church. One of the leaders of that work was a Black Episcopalian born in New York City, who, like many Black Episcopalians before the Civil War, actually supported the idea of colonization in Africa and went to Liberia and spent most of his ministry before the Civil War in Liberia, and after the Civil War comes back to the United States and begins organizing African Americans in the Episcopal Church in those efforts. And the Episcopal Church eventually begins, white Episcopalians eventually begin to shift in their attitude because of these Black Episcopalians in their midst, understanding that this was part of the work they had to do. I think it's important to understand, of course, that, as you all know, a lot of Black Christians decided it wasn't worth it to be in church with white people. And so they set up their independent churches as all Black churches, connected to other all Black churches with no denominational connection to white churches. So that's the African Methodist Episcopal, the African Methodist Zion, and then later on, the organized Black Baptist. But Black Episcopalians were like Black people who are Congregationalists or Black people who are Methodists, and stayed in those predominantly white denominations and saw that as a place to influence white people, not only in that church, but those white people who had positions in the general society to influence how they proceeded on the whole issue of race in the United States. The Episcopal Church, that work took a long, long time. Though we were successful in the sense that, unlike the white Methodists who decided to put all the Negroes inside the white Methodist Church into one jurisdiction called the Central Jurisdiction, we prevented that idea, which floated around by white people in the Episcopal Church, from ever happening there. The big turnaround, like in most denominations that were both white and Black, is of course the post-World War II 1950s beginning of a serious interest in the idea of racial integration, or more accurately, desegregation in the United States. And in the Episcopal Church, Episcopalians were, and Black Episcopalians allied with liberal white Episcopalians were able to force that question on the organized church. And from between 1950 and 1965, most of the segregated institutions in the Episcopal Church were desegregated. In 1991, and this gets to your question, my long introduction to the answer to your question. In 1991, Black people are organized enough and influential enough in the Episcopal Church that they get the national organization, the governing organization, to take a stand on racism. And let me just read those words because it's very short and just 2 sentences. And that is that the church, that we should address institutional racism inside our church and society in order to become a church of and for all races, and a church without racism, committed to ending racism in the world. And that, of course, is a grand goal. And it's obviously a goal that we are not close to reaching, but it is a goal. And it is one of the few, it was one of the first predominantly white denominations to take that kind of position. That has led us to the work that we are doing now. Because if you're going to take a statement, have a statement like that, it's taken seriously, you are going to very soon have to deal with the whole question of the truth of your history. And you're going to have to deal with those questions, especially as you begin to discuss, which the Episcopal Church decided to do a few years later, the whole question of reparations. And the Episcopal Church is deeply involved in the discussion of truth telling. One of the benefits of desegregation in the Episcopal Church, of course, is when you open up political offices in the church to people based on their qualifications and not the color of their skin, all of a sudden you realize that you start getting lots of Black people elected. And remember, the word Episcopal means bishop. And so bishops are a big deal in the Episcopal Church. And in the past 20 years, we've elected dozens of African-American bishops in the Episcopal Church, both women and men, to that position. And then some of you, of course, might have heard of the present chief bishop, we call it the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, who is the first African-American to hold that position, Michael Curry.
All right. Thank you very much, Byron. And I'm sure that there will be questions for you about the specifics. Dr. Taylor, would you give us some idea of the kind of work that you have been doing at Old South Church?
First of all, thank you everyone for being here for this important conversation on this Indigenous Peoples Day. I'm going to be sharing my screen, I hope. There we go. So I was originally asked to speak to all the old Boston churches, but I said I really couldn't do that. I will say that most of the churches are working at some of these things or all of these things to some degree or another, but I just don't know enough to speak on behalf of all of them. But with respect to slavery, truth-telling, and healing at Old South Church in Boston, first a word about this church. It was gathered in 1669. Founders were a mixture of Pilgrims and Puritans. It is today a majority white church of 650 members. We minister from a National Historic Landmark prominently located in Boston's Copley Square. We're open 7 days a week, free to the public. And I just want to say that we are committed to this work of truth-telling and healing. We are very much a work in progress, but we have been at it for some time. And we've been on it for a long time, but I recently read a book recommended to me by my colleague, the Reverend June Cooper, called Reparations, a Christian Call for Repentance and Repair. And they talk about 3 practices of repair: repairing truth, repairing power, repairing wealth. And I found these are interesting frames. And so what I did was go back over what we've been doing and what we are doing and frame them in this way. So repairing truth is acknowledging truth, recovering it, and memorializing it. And the first thing I want to say is the stories that we used to tell all the time, the good stories. Old South Church takes credit for the first anti-slavery tract on the soil in 1700. Our 15th senior minister was a radical abolitionist. He threw open the doors of our meeting house to turn it into a recruiting station for the Union Army. 1,000 men were signed up there. We have famous members like Ben Franklin, Sam Adams, Phyllis Wheatley, or our engagement with the Boston Tea Party. But I now know that, we now know that these stories, while not untrue in any sense, are only the tip of the iceberg, and the rest of the iceberg has a great many more troubling stories. So in terms of repairing truth, we have been engaged for, 4 or 5 years in quite a bit of research about Old South Church relative to slavery, First Nations, abolition. We have essays on that. We've been researching our early members of African descent and our early members and ministers who enslaved others, and putting together quite a bit of lists. We've done quite a bit of work on this. There's more work to be done. can we trace those early members of African descent to their descendants today? I don't know, but we've been reaching out. We sort of hit the wall on what we're able to do. We're reaching out to experts to ask for more assistance. We have now an annual service of remembrance for these early African members. We've been doing this since 2015 when Ann Cobb and Ann Chin brought the idea of the Middle Passage Port Markers Project to Boston. And every year we have a service in which each of these people are named and remembered and honored. We have an annual Phyllis Wheatley Sunday, which we've been doing since 2012. A lot of our sermons, classes, all church reads, messages are around these issues. We have a memorial tree. Here's an image of our columbarium, which is a small chapel in which we, those black boxes are niches for cremated remains. But it also has on the left there a memorial tree. And on that memorial tree on brass leaves are inscribed the names of our early members of African descent so that they might be remembered. For instance, Phyllis Wheatley and whatever dates we have for her, and others for whom we have only the dates of their baptism or membership thus far. And there's a plaque, and I'll read the plaque. Among those persons memorialized on these leaves are members of Old South Church from the 16 and 1700s who were enslaved or of African descent, who, so far as we know, were not buried in marked graves. In most cases, the only date we have for them is the date of their baptism or membership into the church. While they lived and labored in wretched servitude, today they dwell in God's transcendent love, free at last in that building of God, a house not made with human hands, eternal in the heavens, here now and forever on. We remember them. Part of our memorializing. Continuing on the repairing of truth, the acknowledging, recovering, and memorializing, members of our congregation, particularly Dr. Deb Washington, working with others, wrote a curriculum based on the fruits of the Spirit. And we decided early on that our work would first be, we're happy to do work out in the world on Black Lives Matter and, police brutality and whatever, but we wanted to really focus on the inside of our relationships at Old South Church in Boston, and based on our commitment to being the beloved community. We do DEI. At some time we brought in some experts, and all our staff went through DEI, and we've since then baked it into every Tuesday staff meeting, and a different member of staff leads it. We've co-sponsored with City Mission pilgrimages to seek truth and justice. We have a whole bunch of statements and resources on our website to help our members and anyone else to just continue reading, learning, that we might recover, acknowledge, and memorialize the truth. Moving to repairing power. That is seeing power, bringing power, enabling power. As an old white church, most of our music is European, white European music. But in 2005, we launched a weekly jazz worship service with a jazz ensemble, and that forces us to use music that's different. We started a gospel choir in 2010. Our committee on race, which had been working for quite a few years, became a standing committee of council in 2018. That's because over many years, I'd realized, or over the centuries, looking at our history, I'd realized that Old South would get its act together and deal with race here and there now and again, but it was never like a standing committee of council. This is where the power lies in our church. So that group now sits on where the authority and the power is in our church. And Grace Speaks has challenged every single board, committee, and task force at Old South to have a standing agenda item, which is how can this body, this board, committee, or task force overcome racism. We work on hiring, on lay leadership, diversity in these things, and are trying to assure visibility in worship and leadership. We do a lot of signage and posters. Our location is prominent, and so we think that we can use our building as a little bit of a signboard about our values. And so these are some of those sorts of things. Repairing wealth. Building capacity, removing obstacles to wealth, and transferring wealth. Our trustees have invested in Illumin Capital, which is a minority-owned, Black-owned person of color owned investment thing, and diversity is one of the things they actually invest in. We've opened an account with One United, the nation's largest Black owned bank, and encouraged our members to do the same. We do seek out vendors of color. We're very conscious of that. We encourage our members to do the same. We have a partnership with a high school on our block, which is I think 99% of the kids are Black and brown, mentoring, school supplies, laptops. And our annual grants programs, our granting committee is committed to working particularly with organizations that are Black or brown run. So I would say that in summary, Old South Church, with respect to repairing truth, repairing power, and repairing wealth, that we are a work in progress. We are committed to the work, and there's much more to be done.
Thank you very much. We do not have a great deal of time because we had such a lot of information to share from our panelists. But I will say that if there are, if some of you have used the Q&A, we will try to get those questions to the panel participants so that your questions can be answered. Let me just check right now to see if there are some questions that might be easily and quickly answered. Why did not Africans in North America blend their African religions with Christianity as was done in Central and South America? Lamercia, you started to answer that. Perhaps you would continue to do so.
Well, I think that there is a preponderance of what is a Christian doctrine that's in place, actually, that founds the thought of having love and freedom in Christianity here. And it is, as there were not as many enslaved Africans as Byron pointed out here, especially in New England, as I can attest to, that would allow for the kind of unification of thought in that way, in terms of the Africanisms. When we speak of how many diverse representations of Africans and their systems from West Africa and from other parts of Africa were here, we think about how many different practices that are culturally related to those geographic places that they came from would have been represented, rather than there being a concentration of one type of African system of religion being divested, being invested in a particular geographic place. In New England, that was not the case. So as we look to what happens in 1641 in the Body of Liberties, and it's being the first mark of slavery being allowed by law, and Massachusetts being the first to embrace slavery as a law in the American colonies, we look at also that same year, 1641, as the first incident of an enslaved African being baptized. And so as we think about what is the process of Christianity being instilled and embraced, and as you pointed out earlier, Vivian, with why would Africans go to church? Why would they become Christians? It was also associated with literacy development and the right to be able to read and have the Bible. It was associated with the power that was invested here in America. And so it's a more complex question that I have really time to answer. But when I think about people like Phyllis Wheatley and others who challenge Christianity and its practice with respect to girding slavery, she writes they have formed an abolitionist committee that looks at religion as this tool of embracing protection and freedom. And she writes to a Native American minister, Reverend Slocum, who is also a part of the committee. And she says, in every human breast, God has implanted a principle, which we call love of freedom. It is impatient of oppression and pants for deliverance. God grant deliverance in his own way and time, and get him honor among those whose avarice compels them to countenance and help forward the calamities of the fellow creatures. She subtly notes that, like white revolutionaries who are invested in the Revolutionary War, that America's founding has to do with this whole principle of freedom, and Christianity was supposed to be that which upholds it. She says Blacks were getting tired of being held in slavery and might soon take matters into their own hands. And what she was warning the white revolutionaries in the Revolutionary War is that you might not be so triumphant if you don't let go of slavery. And so invested in this idea that there are so many contradictions that are in the context of living here, that Christianity becomes this space of, is it protection of property? Is it protection of profits? Is it protection of souls? Is it the danger of not being Christianized that is confronting you as a Black person, as a person who is experiencing racial slavery? And what do you do about that? And so the organizational structure of what happened with Christianity brought people closer together under the church and under the idea of creating your own space as a church, which is evident in the first African Baptist church built in 1806 in Beacon Hill to practice. But I did want to say that out of New Hampshire, Reverend Thomas Paul and his brothers were all ministers. Nathaniel in Albany, New York, and then Benjamin in the Abyssinia Church in New York. And that they saw this church as a base for the role of the church to present abolition as a way of making slavery go away in America, if you will, or that kind of thing. So I can't answer all of that question, but I think that there are many ways to approach it.
Thank you very much. We're going to have to conclude, and I would ask that you include your email address with the questions that you have put in the chat, and I will make certain that those questions get to the panelists so that you can get a response. We thank everyone who has joined us today, and I want you to know that this has been recorded and it will be made available through the Middle Passage Ceremonies and Port Markers Project. So if you go to their website, you can get further information about it. I would like to thank each one of the panelists, Lamerche Frazier, Byron Rushing, Nancy Taylor, for an extraordinary opportunity to learn about Boston's historic churches and slavery, truth-telling, and healing. Thank you very much.